Hi there, and welcome to First in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write fantastic fiction. I am Molly Jo Riley, producer and facilitator of the podcast, and with us tonight we have co-host Aaron Gansky.
Hello, everybody. I'm Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, the Hand of Adonai series, and Firsts in Fiction, and a handful of other books as well. You will notice Tessa is not joining us tonight. Sadly, she is under the weather, and so we are sending her our good thoughts and prayers. But we do have another amazing co-host stepping in for tonight, or at least for the next few podcasts, actually. Tina Yeager, who is quite knowledgeable in a lot of ways. So Tina, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Hi, I am an author and speaker and life coach, and I am also licensed as a mental health counselor. So I'm actually going to be releasing a new book in July. It's called Beautiful Warrior, Finding Victory Over the Lies Formed Against You. It's coming out with New Hope soon. I'm very excited about that.
That sounds very exciting.
Yes, it's on Christ-centered esteem for women. So I'm very excited about that. And as a counselor, I'm excited to share with your audience, with everybody out there, about how to use psychological principles to shape vivid and unforgettable characters in your fiction.
Ooh, that sounds exciting. So we're looking forward to that. A couple of reminders. You can follow us on YouTube. Click the thumbs up icon. It is the equivalent of a Goodreads or an Amazon review, and it'll help us grow. Share the link with your friends. Leave questions, leave comments. Let us know how we can make this a better podcast for our listeners. And feel free to look back through our archive to get a look at our older videos and give those a thumbs up as well. And I forgot to mention that my first novel, Nola, is finally finished with the round of edits and should be available for publication in mid-June or mid to late June of 2019.
That's very exciting. Very exciting.
By the time this podcast airs, that may have already passed. I don't care. I'm just still really excited. I finally did it.
I'm excited for you. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, we are actually also gearing up to get to Blue Ridge here tomorrow. So we've got a lot of things going on, but one of the things that I was most excited about having Tina on for is to talk about kind of this psychological approach to writing and crafting characters and shaping characters. It's something I've been interested in for quite a while. I try and use what very limited psychology I know when I'm kind of designing characters and crafting characters, but I'm far from an expert. So, Tina, how do you approach that? Like, what specific benefits can psychological insights offer writers?
Well, first of all, of course, it's going to offer some emotional depth to the character. You never want to have a flat character. And then it'll give some authenticity to each of your characters. You don't want to just do this with your protagonist. You want to make sure all the characters are as complex as you possibly can make them, especially the protagonist and antagonist. But you also want to have some very interesting, quirky, unusual, but realistic supporting characters. And that way, when you have the psychology going on in each of those characters, their interactions are going to be interesting and authentic. And then another thing, if you are dealing with all the psychological makeup of your characters before you write the novel, then you can avoid that info dump. How many of you have ever heard from an editor, you've got too much info dump, or avoid all of the information and backstory in the first third of your novel? We hear that all the time, but it's very tempting as a writer to want to write all that stuff in at the beginning as we are discovering our characters, especially if you're an organic writer. I like that better than pantser personally, but you need to make sure that. So, and then in your characters, if they're realistic and they've got some depth to them, you grab the imagination of the reader and they become unforgettable.
That's exciting. I like what you said about organic writing rather than pantsers. Aaron and I are both more organic. I have discovered the process of an outline after the fact to try to keep everything in line. But when I'm going, it's like, oh, I wonder what they're going to do now. So learning tips and tricks to help along that way is pretty cool. How do we sculpt these complex characters without doing that info dump? I mean, we talked about it, but what it is, but how do you accomplish that?
If you take a separate form that you can create using whatever pieces you want to add in, I have one that I use in my workshops or in the Serious Writer Academy. You create this form using some of the tools that a therapist would use in an intake. So you're going to look at some of the things we'll talk about tonight, some key issues that would play into each of the characters' backstory and their psyche. And then you know your character well enough that when you put them on that first page, they are three-dimensional and vivid.
I like that idea of having kind of an intake form. I use something like that. I don't think it's nearly as thorough or fancy, but for me, what I've discovered, this kind of thought process, just even considering the psychological or the psychology of your characters is very important, because most writers tend to write what they know. And so many of their characters, if not all of their characters, end up becoming little versions of the main character, rather than having kind of this diverse conglomeration of personalities. And there's a lot that you can do with that to shape conflict, to form bonds between characters, and to really look at how each character's psychology is going to motivate the decisions that they make. And it adds that kind of variety, which adds another layer of kind of credibility and reliability to the text, I think. And it makes it, I think, far more interesting to read when you see a variety of characters on the page, rather than just several versions of the same type of character.
Or several versions of the author.
Yeah.
Unless you happen to have dissociative identity disorder, that's not going to be really that interesting.
That's true.
So what are some key issues to examine on your character development?
Well, one thing you want to think about is, like, you're sculpting a character. Where am I going to put them? Your character has to be in a world, and it could be a fictitious world, or it could be planet Earth. And then you want to put them in a place in Earth, if that's the world they're in. And in those places where you're going to put your character, there's a culture and a subculture. Like for your novel, NOLA, they're in this really fabulous, rich cultural environment. That is going to be a character in and of itself. And your character, your protagonist, is going to interact with the character of the setting. And then if you think, in addition to that, about their backstory, their ethnicity, where their family has come from, maybe you have someone whose family has immigrated from Japan, and this is the first generation fully born in America, then the parents were born in Japan. You'll have that ethnic culture also playing into the values of the character and what the character thinks about. So think about those things as cultural values and what the character agrees with and what they don't agree with. None of your characters should completely agree with their parents' values or completely agree with their culture's values. If you decide which ones they agree with and which ones they disagree with, that'll give some complexity to your character right there.
And again, that's also another layer of conflict, because as children, we tend to accept most of the morals and ethics of our parents, but not all of them. And so that is a great place to kind of mine some tension and some conflict, is what the disagreements between people who are very closely related, either family relations or friends or whatever the case may be, that being able to tap into that, knowing that about your characters, is going to help you kind of find some natural conflict. It's going to help the story kind of move along as well.
And you could add personality. You can use different personality surveys, and you could look at those different MBTI is one that people tend to know, or you could use DISC, or you could use any of the personality surveys that you want to choose from and put that on your intake sheet and decide what kind of personality your character has, your main character, your antagonist. Say you have an extrovert and an introvert together that are supporting characters with the main character, they're going to respond to one another differently. So think about those things. Those can help you create tension and describe how people interact with one another. You can also do a mental status exam, which is something I would have done in an intake with a client. I don't always write it out, but thinking about certain things about your character. If that character was sitting in front of you, what would they look like? Would they be disheveled? If they're depressed, they might not use appropriate self-care. They might not be grooming themselves, so they might be a little bit off in their in their hair care and their grooming and their bathing. So think about things like that. Their appearance. Are they dressed flamboyantly? Because that's part of what's going on with them mentally. Are they in their behavior and activity? Are they sluggish? Are they overactive? Are they fidgeting? Do they have certain habits or tics that they do? Think about their speech, not just with regard to dialect, but also how fast they speak. If one of your characters happens to have a manic phase going on, then they're going to have pressured speech. If they are expressing their emotions appropriately, this is a good one. Even if you don't have a mental health disorder in one of your characters, sometimes we as human beings, well, not sometimes, most of the time, try to hide what our true emotions are. So is what you're saying matching up with the appropriate tone and expression of what is really going on in your life? Sometimes people, you see them on the news, they're laughing almost or smiling, and they're in the middle of what was a crime scene. It doesn't seem like it matches, but that's that person being in shock or coping with that situation. So think about those kinds of things.
So I'm hearing again a couple of things, specifically with conflict, where your character feels one way inwardly, but is pressured or feels as if they must behave differently on the outside. And so this tension between this interior conflict between the internal emotional state, the psychological state versus their outward appearance, I think is really important. And I like that you link them together. We tend to think a lot, writers tend to think a lot about what their characters look like, their hair color, their eye color, etc. But how they groom themselves, their grooming habits, how they present themselves and the way that they dress. I tend to tell my students that they need to think about not necessarily what their characters look like in terms of hair color, eye color, because for the most part, we have very little say in that. But instead, what focus on the outward appearance that can be controlled by the character and how the character chooses to present themselves to others. That can tell you a lot about the character that you're developing.
Mm-hmm. The nature of a character needs to reflect the nature of human beings. And the one thing that determines who we are more than anything else, more than nature, more than nurture, is our choice, how we respond to nature and nurture. So that's absolutely true.
I'm just absorbing all of this information, and part of me is like, oh, I wish I had known this before I started writing my book. And another part of me is like, yes, I got it right. So, yay. You have a note in here about how your character also responds to the crisis. That's what you were talking about with the response. How can all these details together factor into the way the character appears in the novel?
Well, again, like Erin was saying, you're going to have an internal conflict and an external conflict. Plus, you'll have that internal motivation. What's the character's fears? What are their dreams? What are their goals? And then the external motivation. There's going to be something in the plot that the character is working against or working toward. So think about how the character, knowing their backstory, knowing their personality, knowing their mental status, how are they going to respond to the external based on their internal?
So give us some ideas on some key psychological issues that might prove relevant for characters that would be good for developing these types of in-depth struggling characters. What kind of issues have you seen?
Well, statistically speaking, abuse is huge. It's such a prevalent issue with so many people that your character could very realistically have undergone some sort of abuse in childhood. That would be something to study and to pay attention to with regard to your character. If you have a character who's been a victim of childhood abuse, that person would likely be averse to having someone control them, or averse especially to feeling helpless. So that would be something that would create an intense conflict with their other characters, with the antagonist, with their plot that they're dealing with, their conflict that they're working through. So that's something. Or PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. If someone has developed that as a result of abuse or war or some other situation, that would be something to pay attention to and really study. Again, if you really want to study these and get them right because they're so prevalent, people will know if you haven't studied them and if you get it wrong. Anxiety is a good one to study too, because all of your characters should be facing some kind of tension, some kind of worry, even if it's not a clinically diagnosable anxiety disorder. Knowing the symptoms of a panic attack will help you better render feeling worried in a visceral way.
You're mentioning so many good things, and it's,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it should be alarming to me that going down this list, I'm like, yeah, I know people who deal with this. I know people who deal with this, and people close to me that deal with a lot of these. And, names are coming to mind, faces are coming to mind. And it's one of those things where it's like, these are the names and the faces of people who are dealing with some of these. We all, I think, deal with something on this list to some degree or another. Anxiety specifically, we're all going to be anxious. How we respond to that anxiety is different. Some people thrive on it. Some people really enjoy it. It gets them going, and they use that anxiety and they channel it, and they try and find ways to resolve the problems. And other people tend to run, and that's all very good. Knowing where the different approaches to dealing with some of these is very valuable. And I come back to this. It's a bit of a soapbox. I've said it before, and so I apologize to everybody who's heard me say this probably 22 times. But when we're talking about abuse, we need to not just say, oh, our character has been abused. As dark as it is, as painful as it can be, we need to go to those dark places and find out what kind of abuse, specifically, because if I've got a story of abuse, it's going to be wildly different than the person sitting next to me who has their own story of abuse. Yes, there will be commonalities, but I tend to react this way because I see students, especially new writers, especially, they want to write about the son of an alcoholic or the daughter of an alcoholic, and they say something where the parent is drinking a beer, but it doesn't seem to feel true, because I've known children of alcoholics. It's not just beer that they're drinking. It's a specific beer. It's a specific drink that they like. There's this layer of specificity in how abuse or neglect may come out in different characters' histories. And so even though it's kind of scary and dark to go to those places, to create really truly authentic characters, these are considerations that we have to make and really kind of explore.
We want to make sure that we don't create stereotypes, but we also want to be authentic. So if you haven't interviewed people that have been on the ground level with these issues, you probably should take the time to do that. Or when your story's in print, people will call you out on it. Go to an AA meeting or an NA meeting if you're going to render something about addiction. Make sure that you've talked to real people who have experienced this, and also consult the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Disorders, because there's clinical things that are listed in there that'll show you exactly what is different if someone has alcoholism and a personality disorder or just alcoholism. And if you're just getting anecdotal information, you might get those blended together and make an untrue rendering of what an alcoholic looks like.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's important to remain authentic, because, like you say, if we're going to the stereotype, that can actually be quite offensive to a lot of people. And so trying to render it with compassion and specificity, it's a tough line to walk, but it is one that's very important. So even if you don't have people that you can go to immediately, if you can't get to that AA meeting, like you mentioned, do some research online, do some research, psychology journals and things of that nature, and kind of get a sense of how people react to some of these stresses that have been put on them. And I think what you'll find is those characters tend to come alive. One of my favorite characters came from a kind of an abusive place, and I had to figure out what it was and how it affected her. And she became a very endearing character, and she's widely regarded as one of the favorite characters among my readers. They all kind of point to this character and say, yeah, this is our favorite. And I think it's because there is that layer of kind of specificity, and it's not just kind of the cliche backstory. That she's kind of taken it a different direction.
Mm-hmm.
If you can develop empathy from your reader to the character, you have absolutely captivated the reader. And not creating stereotypes and not creating negative stigma about mental illness is really, really important. And creating empathy is one way to really help not just your story, but to help people connect with other real people. That's one of the best things about fiction, is it helps us be more understanding and compassionate individuals.
Very well said. Very well said.
One last question before we run out of time is, you both hit on this a little bit, but where else, other than online and going to actual group meetings for these types of people, where else, how else can a writer do research into these psychological issues?
Other than meeting with people in chat rooms online, if you can find them, who discuss this, or getting some specific books that address this. Like there's Leanne Jeffries had a book, The Bipolar Experience, that was co-written by Eva Marie Everson. So books like that come from a perspective of someone who's walked through these things can be really, really helpful.
Absolutely. Personal experience is valuable. There's a wealth of books out there. I would suggest documentaries. I watched a documentary on these when I was writing a novel that featured several characters dealing with these types of things. And I wanted to be appropriate and sensitive to the issues. And so I watched some documentaries. So there are a lot of good documentaries out there as well. That's what I would suggest.
Okay.
Yeah. But we are up against the clock here. Our time is ticking down. Tina, thank you so much for joining us. This was awesome. We are going to be back in another couple of weeks. We're going to be talking about how to overcome discouragement and or stress. So we're looking not at the psychology of characters, but psychology of fiction writers, which might actually be a deeper, darker place. So,
yay!
Yeah, exactly. So we do thank you all for joining us, and we hope you'll come back in a couple of weeks. And until then, good writing.